Board games are more than just fun. They're a powerful way to learn Chinese, boosting vocabulary, fluency, and communication skills. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about how to use board games to learn Chinese. I often emphasize trying to find enjoyable ways of learning because that will allow you to invest more time in the long run and therefore you will also learn more. In this case though, it's not only about having fun, because I do genuinely believe that games in general, and maybe board games in particular, have a lot to offer when it comes to language learning and language teaching, beyond being interesting and fun in themselves. As we shall see in this episode, playing board games has a lot of benefits for you as a Chinese learner. It will help you build vocabulary, improve your fluency, and perhaps most importantly, it will help you to truly communicate in Chinese and go beyond drills and other language-focused exercises. I have talked about games on the podcast before, and that's because, well, I like games and I like language learning and teaching, and I do think, as I said, that they go very well together. For example, in episode 134, we talked about how to use mahjong to learn and teach Chinese. So if you want more and maybe more specific advice and suggestions for how to use board games, maybe you can tune into that episode after this one, and as usual, I'll put links in the show notes. So let's start our discussion about board games by looking at why they can be beneficial for you as a language learner. I mentioned some of these briefly already, but let's go into a little bit more detail here. And so the first benefit is that playing board games in Chinese encourages you to focus on meaning and real communication. And there are two key words here. It's the focus on meaning and it's the real communication. So when I say focus on meaning, I mean that as opposed to focus on form. And form here might be, say, how things are pronounced, grammar, how things are written, and so on, the way the language looks and sounds, as it were. And the meaning then is what we want to convey with it. And many language learners, especially those who are enrolled in formal courses, but many independent learners as well, spend way too much time focusing on the language, not what you can do with it, not with actually communicating with other people. And this is where the second part comes in, the real communication. And this means that the primary goal is to convey some kind of information to somebody else by speaking, for example, or it could be the opposite. Somebody else is trying to talk to you and you need to understand. But the goal is not to practice the language. It's not to see how this word is used or something like that. It is to convey some kind of information that is important. And in the game, it could of course be anything related to the game. I mean, directly something happening in the game, or it could be something related to the game around the table, maybe socially or something else. But the point is that you are communicating for real with other people. It is not just something you do to practice the language itself. For more about real communication and how this is different from what many people think communication is about, check out episode 189. The next benefit with playing board games is that it's a clever way to repeat the same vocabulary items and grammar patterns over and over without it becoming boring. This is because you're using the words to communicate, as I said, real communication, not to practice. Because if you just practice language forms and you are reviewing a vocabulary item many times, it will get boring pretty quickly. But if you use these words in a meaningful context, in a fun setting, such as a game, you can repeat something many, many times without it feeling boring at all. I will occasionally refer to specific board games throughout this article, just as an example, and in this case we might look at a game like Settlers of Catan, that I think many people will know about, and if you don't, you probably should look it up. But if you don't know the game and don't know how to play it, that doesn't really matter, it's just an example. But in that game, for example, you need to trade for resources, and there are 5 different types of resources, and when you play this game, you need to say these all the time, because that's how you tell other people what you have, and also how you ask for what other people might have to trade with you. This is not only true for game-specific words, such as the resources in that game, it's also true for phrases that are used a lot when playing games in general. So for example, asking whose turn it is, or saying that it's my turn or your turn. Things like that you repeat very often, and so they will become second nature very quickly. Next up, I'd like to point out that board games are meant to be fun, and as I said in the intro, having fun is important because it will allow you to invest more time. Like I said, it's not the main reason I think board games are good for learning and teaching Chinese, but still it is important. If you think that board games are fun, it's a great idea to use them to learn languages. For more about long-term motivation and the importance of having fun, check out episode 188. The next benefit of playing board games is that it is social, so it's a great way to connect with other people. And if you listen to that episode about long-term motivation, you will know that relatedness, or our ability to socially interact and connect with other people, is one of the basic psychological needs we humans have. While board games are more popular in the West than they are in China, I still think there are many people who are interested in board games, and many of the major games are also translated into Chinese. And if you have Chinese friends, or if you want to play with other language learners who are also into board games, that's great. The final benefit with board games that I want to mention is that it gives you a chance to teach and instruct others. So for example, you can imagine bringing your favorite board game and having to explain it in Chinese. And just like I said with interacting with other people just now, this is not something you have to do with Chinese-speaking people. It could be with other students. For example, I introduced the board game Carcassonne to some fellow students during my first semester of learning Chinese, and we were all foreigners, but they hadn't played the game, and I had, so I used the Chinese we had learned to introduce it to them. And it was a struggle, of course. This was my first semester, but it was still possible. You have lots of things to point to, and it's not that complicated. In general, teaching is a great way of learning, and there is an article about this on Hacking Chinese that I'll put a link to in the show notes, but it hasn't made it to the podcast yet. So now that we know why it's a good idea to use board games to learn Chinese, let's talk a little bit about which board games to play. Naturally, we all like different types of games, but if we're looking at it from a language learning perspective, there are some games that will contain more language than others, and different types of games obviously put different demands on your Chinese proficiency. I just mentioned Carcassonne, and this is a game you can play without saying anything. There are no rules that require you to say anything during the whole game, so you can just be silent. Naturally, this doesn't mean that people are silent when they play the game. You can comment on what's going on and comment on what other people are doing, or just talk about other things. And there are many things you can talk about during a game, even if the game itself doesn't contain any language and doesn't require you to say anything. Some of the benefits with board games for learning languages comes from using language in the game, because you need to achieve some kind of goal or convey some information in the game itself, but you can also use games that don't contain any language at all. I mentioned Mahjong earlier, which has some language in it. I mean, you have to read characters, and most people also call out the tiles that they play as they play them, and there are a few other things you have to say in Chinese in order to be able to play the game. Then we can continue across the spectrum towards games that rely a lot on language. For example, any type of werewolf game where there are hidden roles and people are supposed to figure out who's the bad guy before the bad guy wins. And I'm talking about, well, Are You a Werewolf? Or maybe Among Us and games like that. They are very reliant on language, and basically the only thing you do in these games is talk with other people. That requires more than 50 words of Chinese, but it can be done at fairly low levels as well. For a broader overview of different games and how they can be used to learn and teach Chinese, check out episode 105, which was about 10 ways of using games to learn and teach Chinese. To be able to play board games in Chinese, you do need some kind of source for the language you're going to use. And if it's game specific, the best place to find this language is in the rulebook. Or you can look up other people discussing, reviewing, or maybe instructing how to play the game online, and that way you can access that vocabulary. Then there are also general terms which will be assumed that the player knows, because most rulebooks are not written for non-native speakers, and I'm talking about things like whose turn is it, it's my turn, things like that. And if you want phrases and words that are general for board games, I did collect a lot of them in the written article on Hacking Chinese, so check the link in the show notes and go to the very bottom of the article where I have a long list of generic or general board game terms and phrases that you can use. Here I would also like to recommend a video published by Scritter, which is also about how to use board games to learn Chinese, and it was based partly on the original written article on Hacking Chinese, and that video also contains some phrases and words that might be useful. To conclude this episode, I'd like to say that I've learned a lot from playing games, talking about games, instructing other people how to play games, and so on, in Chinese, both with non-native speakers and with native speakers. I hope that in this episode I've been able to explain why I think that board games are more than just fun. They are genuinely great for improving many areas of Chinese that are tricky to get at through formal education. And if it's enjoyable and fun at the same time, well, what are you waiting for? Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.